all of those of you in the room and our online audience, and of course to all of our speakers who I'm going to introduce in a minute. Please, if you're in the room, if you could turn your phones on to silent, and if you're tweeting, please do, using the hashtag that I think is up on the screen, hashtag Urban Africa. My name's Arabella Fraser. I'm a research fellow here at ODI in the Risk and Resilience Programme. I also convene the Institute's working group on urban development. I think some of their researchers are in the room. That's a group that cuts across all of our programmes to bring together work on urban development and resilience. But our discussion today is going to centre on the question of how we can build resilience for Africa's urban future. As many of you will know, Africa is undergoing a late and fast-paced urbanisation process, and its urban population is expected to triple by 2050. Disaster risks in Africa's urban areas are rising, and in general, the African region is warming faster than the world as a whole, with climate change exacerbating urban disaster risks, both through its direct impacts, but also indirect impacts on water and food security systems, as well as on population movements from rural to urban areas. So this process of demographic and climate change is driving and will continue to drive an increase in the disaster and climate change risks faced in particular by low-income populations in urban areas who are both exposed due to where they live, but also extremely vulnerable due to high levels of poverty, informality, and the large-scale deficits in infrastructure and services. So the challenge of building urban resilience for Africa's urban future is multifaceted, and although there are huge variations, there are also some common features across the region. But it encompasses the need to address uncertain future climate risks in the context of data scarcity, deep inequality, access to critical infrastructure, the creation of inclusive economies, environmental health, and critically the capacities of social actors and institutions, including effective planning and the rule of law. And this question of how risk is evolving with the urbanisation process in Africa is explored in two journal special issues that we're marking today. One, a volume of the journal Environment and Urbanisation, edited by David on my right and Sheridan Bartlett, on understanding the full spectrum of risks facing urban Africa into the future. And I'm going to ask David to talk a little more about this in a minute. And the other is a forthcoming volume of the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction on Africa's Urban Risk and Resilience, edited by myself, Hayley Lecker, Mark Pelling from King's College London, and Sue Parnell from the University of Cape Town. And we have some copies of the introduction and the abstracts for that issue floating around if you're interested. And some of the contributing authors are also here in the room. So the papers in the two volumes also start to look at what are the emergent solutions for the future of Africa's urban areas, such as community-based movements, and how can they partner with local governments to deliver solutions that work at scale. And it's really this focus on potential solutions and opportunities that I'd like to draw out today. So we've got about an hour and a half for today's discussion until 2:00, and then here in London we'll have the opportunity to have tea and coffee from 2:00 and discuss the issues more informally. So we'll kick off by hearing from our invited speakers, and then we'll have a Q&A. And for those of you online, do send your questions to us using the online chat form throughout the event. If you put your name and organisation, we'll be able to ask those during the Q&A. And before I turn to Matafu here and David, I'm delighted to welcome also Mark Pelling, who's a Professor of Geography at King's College London and the Principal Investigator of the Urban Africa Risk Knowledge Programme, which has supported the publication of these two research volumes. His research interests are in the social and institutional aspects of climate change adaptation and disaster risk management. He's been a lead author for the IPCC SREX report in AR5 and in the scoping report, the sixth scoping report for AR6. And in addition to Urban Arc, he leads research into urban transitions towards transformative development pathways and transformative solutions to food security, much in collaboration with Christian Aid. So I'd like to ask Mark to open for us by commenting on what the major opportunities might be for building resilience for Africa's urban future. Mark.
Thanks very much, Ari, and thanks ODI for hosting this event. Much appreciated. A quick word on Urban Arc and then some framing thoughts for the discussion to offer to the panel. Urban Arc, Urban Africa Risk Knowledge, is a £3.33 million investment from ESRC and DFID, working across 7 cities in sub-Saharan Africa, bringing together universities here and in our sub-Saharan African cities, humanitarian organisations, International Alert is in the audience, for example, IIED, UN Habitat, and of course city governments and stakeholder organisations as well. The mission behind Urban Arc is to identify and work with practitioners to try and break cycles of risk accumulation. So very much a development problematique around risk management, although we also have, of course, hazards, climate modelling elements to the programme. But just three thoughts, really, perhaps to offer today in the next minute and a half that I have. And these are trying to bring together three strands in thinking and practice, I think, that risk management highlights. The first is the relationship between resilience and risk management, and a recognition that some of the challenges, particularly around understanding what resilience is in cities, is beginning to be resolved through risk management, and that there's an opening of a sort of hybrid space, something which one might call risk-sensitive urban development, that can begin to be defined around perhaps being inclusive, something that might come from particularly resilience, integrative, and representing the whole spectrum of risk, from risk reduction, preparedness to response. So if one begins to hold that in one's head and puts it against the second of these dynamics, which for me is the deficit of democracy and technical expertise within cities of sub-Saharan Africa. And this, of course, is a long process of erosion, but it is structural. It is linked to the behaviour of donors and national governments, but also the way in which city authorities themselves have acted. There seems to be, and this then talks to the third point, an opening of creative space at the relationship between city government, the lowest level of democratic representation, and organised civil society. These relationships have been going on for many years, and people in the room, not least David and Tafu, have been working with these groups for some long time. But particularly around risk management and resilience, there seems to be an opening of a collaborative space, recognising the need to address fundamental processes of urbanisation around this new emerging relationship. It's a strengthening of city authority as well as civil society. And I hope we'll talk to that today. That to me seems to be, if there is a new space, a new way of working, it's there. And if it's connected to an intellectual or policy agenda, it's this emergence of a more synthetic, urban, risk-sensitive development approach, getting past some, I think, of the drag that resilience has brought, being potentially a complicated and contested idea. So I'll finish there. Thanks very much again to Ari and ODI.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'd like to introduce our full panel of speakers and then invite them to contribute. We have David Satterthwaite from the International Institute for Environment and Development, Matafu Mwanda from Mzizi University in Malawi, and online we have Sky Dobson from Slum Dwellers International and Megan Spires from ICLE, which is the Local Governments for Sustainability Network. So we're going to start with David. David is a senior fellow at IIED and visiting professor at University College London. He was coordinating lead author of the chapter on urban adaptation in the fifth assessment of the IPCC and the lead editor for journal Environment and Urbanisation. And his recent books include, although there are many, Cities on a Finite Planet, co-edited with Sheridan Bartlett. So David, if we think about the nature and scale of climate-related risks in urban Africa, low-income urban populations are affected by a broad range of risks, from everyday health risks to episodic small-scale and large-scale disaster risks. But what are the most critical interventions that African governments and international development partners can take to address these multiple forms of risk now and into the future?
Oh, a nice, easy question. Can I ask you to think of a city in the global south that you know well, you know best? Do you know the main cause of death? Do you know the main cause of premature death? Do you know the main cause of premature death in informal settlements? But these would seem to be critically important for understanding risk and responses to risk. But why is it so difficult to actually identify such data? Three issues interest me. What are the largest risks facing low-income groups in cities in sub-Saharan Africa? Which of these risks is easily prevented or enormously reduced? And how can we build resilience to the most serious risks? So what are the largest risks facing urban dwellers? Nairobi, Lagos, Mombasa, Accra. If we look at the data, it tends to be disasters. Disasters get recorded. If we look at Dar es Salaam, for instance, there's good records of floods and how many people were killed over the last 20 to 30 years. We have global databases on floods that tell us how many people died, not usually in cities, but at least in regions where you can unpick some of the city statistics. Of course, this doesn't pick up many of the small floods. If you look at the careful case studies of informal settlements in African cities, you find there's flooding happens every year. Many floods that kill 1 or 2 people don't get recorded. So if we take the official records on floods in cities and we add to them the informal records, possibly also through the application of the desinventar methodology that picks up all the local sources on 1 or 2 deaths, we get a picture of flood risk in a city. We aggregate all those reports and we can begin to identify the total contribution to premature death. Or if all the reports have a location, you can begin to map flood risk and where it's most serious. But what doesn't get recorded? Most of sub-Saharan Africa no longer have vital registration systems. They no longer have the office of the coroner. There is no systematic collection of deaths from premature death. There's no records of serious illness or injury. We get little partial glimpses. Sometimes a hospital will keep records. But of course the hospital records are only for those people that went to the hospital for treatment or died at the hospital. So think of Dar es Salaam. It's a city that I know a little and have enjoyed visiting over the years. And if you ask many people in the risk business, what are the most serious risks in Dar es Salaam, they'll say flooding. And flooding probably accounts for between 60 and 100 deaths a year, maybe more, but probably not a lot more. 60 deaths a year. 5,000 deaths a year come from diarrheal diseases. 6,000 deaths come from acute respiratory infections. 7,000 to 8,000 deaths come from HIV, associated often with TB. Malaria, it's difficult to get statistics, but if you put all the sources together, there's probably thousands of deaths from malaria. Now, these haven't been included in much of the work on risk assessment because there's no reports on which you can base the quantification. Of course, these risks vary enormously by informal settlement. In Nairobi, for instance, the under-5 mortality rate between the worst informal settlement and the middle-class areas is 30-fold. 30 times more children die before the age of 5 in the lowest income areas compared to the highest income areas. What we've sought to do in Urban Arc is to understand the full spectrum of risk. So it includes disease-causing agents, it includes chemical pollutants, it includes physical hazards, and it goes from the everyday hazards through the small disasters that the desinventar methodology generally picks up, through to the large disasters, and then also factors in likely future disasters brought by climate change. From this comes a much stronger information base on how to reduce risk. It sounds a bit obvious, but if you remove a risk that a particular group is vulnerable to, there's no vulnerable group. Infants and young children are very vulnerable to acute respiratory infections, but if there's a quick response from a medical team, they're no longer vulnerable. The enormous impact of diarrheal disease on health and on death in informal settlements can be virtually removed with a good water and sanitation and solid and liquid waste collection system. However, the most encouraging thing for me is that there's a new source of data on risk, on vulnerability, that goes into a lot of detail and covers all informal settlements. This has been pioneered by the federations of slum dwellers, the federations of shack dwellers that are now active in over 35 nations. In at least 10 nations in sub-Saharan Africa, you have a strong federation of slum dwellers, federation of shack dwellers, sometimes called federation of homeless people, who have looked at the lack of data on informal settlements and who've done these very detailed and careful profiles of each informal settlement, looking at threat of eviction, water, sanitation, drainage, healthcare, schools, rule of law, presence of NGOs, presence of religious groups, relationship with politicians. And that is done for each informal settlement. And we've now got records, and Skye Dobson knows far more about this than I do, and I'm sure she'll give you more details. But these informal settlement profiles have been done in hundreds of cities, in thousands of informal settlements. And not only does this produce a very rich idea of risk and its underlying causes, but it provides an idea of their priorities. A lot of the profiles spend a lot of time asking the community organizations to state what their health priorities are and what the health consequences. So I would absolutely agree with Mark that here is an information base that provides a new possibility for local governments to work with grassroots organizations and together form, drive and implement new risk reduction agendas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And that is indeed the perfect moment to turn to Skye, who is joining us by video link. So Skye Dobson is the Director of the Learning Monitoring and Evaluation Unit for the Transnational Slum Dwellers International Network, presently based in the SDI Secretariat in Cape Town, South Africa. She's an urban development professional with 10 years' experience working in sub-Saharan African cities. Prior to her current role, she served as Executive Director of Act Together Uganda, the supporting NGO to the National Slum Dwellers Federation of Uganda. Skye, obviously you've been involved in projects across Africa supporting community-driven initiatives to build resilience in Africa's towns and cities. Could you maybe give us a few examples of how these initiatives are building resilience and how they might be scaled up?
Sure. Hi, Ari, and hi to everybody in the room and to everybody online. Thank you for allowing SDI to be a part of this important conversation. As I was introduced, I'm working for SDI. David gave us a very nice introduction in his presentation. We are a transnational network of slum dweller federations. The slum dweller federations are communities organized in informal settlements throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They're organized around savings. They come together in savings groups, women-led savings groups for the most part. These savings groups are networked at the settlement level, slum settlement, then at the city level, then again at the national level to create this critical mass of slum dwellers that are organized using tools like the ones that David was explaining to gather information on their settlements and on their cities in order to use this information to start a productive dialogue with government, which is the sort of beginning of this innovative collaborative space that Mark was referring to earlier. So throughout Africa now there are 18 slum dweller federations in West, East, and Southern Africa. I think there must be now 15 that are doing profiling and enumeration at the city level as part of an initiative that we call the Know Your City initiative, which is a partnership between Slum Dwellers International, Cities Alliance, and UCLGA, which is the local government association for Africa. So the partnership is embedded into this process with communities gathering the data, and that really serving as the basis for the discussion around urban poverty, around building resilience that is inclusive and far more sustainable than that we've seen to date. So this is the organization. We think that the shift, I'm going to give you a few examples from my time in Uganda, but I think in terms of the shift required to achieve sort of a new level of scale in building urban resilience, we think that if there are 1 billion slum dwellers in the world at present, if we think of this 1 billion slum dwellers as a population to whom resilience needs to be delivered, we'll be really missing an important opportunity to actually catalyze the energies and the efforts of these communities to really be on the front line of building resilience and reducing poverty, and not the resilience of only the slum settlements, but actually of the city at large when we shift our thinking when engaging with urban poor communities. So with that shift, why do I say that? Why do I say they can be on the front line? I'll give an example. As when I was introduced, you heard that I used to work in Uganda, so let me use that as an example. If we think about, say, the City Resilience Index or framework, the one we can all argue about which framework is appropriate or not appropriate, but the general idea that resilience is multifaceted and that it incorporates issues of health, issues of leadership and strategy, issues of infrastructure and ecosystems and economy and society. I think we can all agree that it's a multidimensional approach, and we have to think about the resilience in these terms. I think when we look at that framework just as an example, and then try to overlay the work of organized communities, we can see very clearly how they and their partnerships with local government contribute to each of these dimensions of resilience. If we look at, say, the leadership and strategy element, if we look at empowered stakeholders, if we look at integrated development planning and effective leadership and management, we see that these slum dweller federations are organized and really coming together to not look, so a regular savings group might look at the issue of its members, but when these groups are networked at the settlement and city level, then they're starting to look at issues that face the city. Oh, at large. Sorry, I was trying to time myself to be very succinct. I just got an alarm. So the communities are organized, and then this empowerment comes from not just participation in sort of the agenda of others, but the joint collaboration to form an agenda around resilience. And this is done through the organizing of the savings and the peer-to-peer exchange and the social cohesion that is built up when communities organize. If we look at health and well-being, we see the efforts being made by these communities and their partnerships to minimize human vulnerability through incremental upgrading of slum settlements. Of course, this has incredible benefits to reducing some of the vulnerabilities and the risks that David was mentioning regarding diarrhea and respiratory illness, malaria. So we see there a very clear link. We see on the level of economy and society, which we see the community support from the savings. So communities they have a social safety net that perhaps otherwise wouldn't be there through both their relationships, but also through the savings that they are making, and also then through the dialogue that they're able to have with government in terms of crisis. In terms of the infrastructure and ecosystems, we see communities, if in situ upgrading is prioritized rather than this urban sprawl and building in a very unsustainable and unaffordable way, we see the benefits to the actual functioning of the city at large as a viable sort of space. So in Uganda, for instance, we have communities organized in 21 municipalities. They've done citywide profiling in each of those municipalities, so the 5 municipalities within Kampala and then the other secondary cities throughout the country. They have MOUs and to engage in city and municipal forums with governments in each of those areas. They have minimized, or they've been working to minimize vulnerability through community-led upgrading projects and jointly managed community upgrading funds at the city and municipal level. They are creating new livelihood opportunities in sustainable and resilient infrastructure and services such as solar energy, clean cooking, biofuel toilets, and all kinds of innovative new technologies. And we see commitments being made with government around the formulation of urban renewal plans that are far more inclusive and collaboratively designed with communities. So I think my time is up. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sky, and we'll return to some of your points in the discussion. So it's my great pleasure to then introduce Matafu Mando, who's a senior lecturer in planning at the Land Management Department in Mzizi University in Malawi and is in London for this week. Is that right?
Thank you.
So he's a team leader of the Urban Arc Research Programme in Karonga Town in Malawi and also founder of the NGO Urban Research and Advocacy Centre based in Mzizi. And his research interests are in urban informality, disaster risk management and urban food security. So Matafu, it's obviously the small and medium-sized cities in Africa that are experiencing particularly high growth, and your recent research has focused on Karonga Town, which is an urban centre of around an expected 63,000 inhabitants, and one which has suffered heavily from flooding and other disasters. What is different about the kind of risk dynamics in smaller and medium-sized towns and cities compared to the larger cities, and how can we better meet their needs into the future?
Thank you very much. Perhaps I should start with what I heard before, that small is beautiful, but unfortunately, small towns are all neglected. I think that's the problem I have already. So I don't know what was the wisdom of the person who said small is beautiful, when I see that nearly everyone is thinking large is beautiful. So that's the starting point of problems of small towns. The politics, the planning, the policy, and the practice, all of them don't think about small towns. The politics don't want the small towns because perhaps they don't live there, but also because they want to benefit from the chaos. There are no governance structures. So if there's a chaotic situation, the politicians would like to benefit from that one because they know that there are votes. So when there's some disaster occurring in that area, when they go as some kind of savior, then they are seen to be very good. So they will benefit from the situation. And because of that, the risks in these small towns will escalate. And we are talking of the risks, simple risks like poor sanitation, lack of access to good water, and usually even to drainage systems. They are not there. So these are the challenges of these small cities, small towns, as you may call them. But it's my view that although this could be seen as a case they are living with, it could also be seen at the same time as a blessing in disguise. Because being small, their problems are still small. And being small, they are not yet complex. And their population is still small. So there is an opportunity to resolve their problems even now. That's my expectation. You asked also what can be done. I think that because there are no systems presently in all these small centers, or where systems exist, they are actually only on paper. It's better to work with the communities. In the case of Malawi, the communities could be, as David was talking about, OSCU, it could be the organized communities. But in some of these centers, there's no organization of the community. They still rely on the customary structures. They still rely on the chiefs. So it is up to us to work with the chiefs to find a mechanism of organizing the communities to get our entry point to solve these problems. What we have done in Karonga ourselves was to work with the chiefs and to create a structure which exists in the policy, but which was not there on the ground. So we had to create the disaster risk management committees. We worked with the chiefs, and we worked also with the school leavers to create this platform for data collection and data analysis. I think it is working very well. If this were to be followed in all the other small towns in Malawi, perhaps also elsewhere, it could resolve the major problem of small towns. I think I can stop there unless there are big questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues and questions. Thank you, Matafe. And finally, I'm going to turn to Megan Spires, who joins us online. Megan works as a senior manager responsible for climate change, energy and resilience within the Africa Secretariat of ICLEI, which is the leading global network of over 1,500 cities, towns and regions committed to building a sustainable future. She holds a PhD from Rhodes University, and before joining ICLEI, she worked as a climate protection scientist in the city of Durban in South Africa. So, Megan, you've worked both as a government official, now for an intergovernmental network, as well as on kind of numerous related research projects. I wanted to shift the focus a little away, perhaps from community and local government, upwards to big new international agreements, such as the Sendai Framework, the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, the corollary of the New Urban Agenda. What does this mean for local governments who need to build resilience in the future in Africa? And indeed, are these agreements influencing the ways in which urban actors in the region are planning for the future?
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I think first and foremost, it's important to note that all of these agreements most definitely are, like never before, acknowledging cities. Cities and towns are being both causing a lot of the global challenges that we're facing, but also are almost incubators of solutions. And I think that's been decades of advocacy work that ICLEI and other organizations have done to indicate why cities and towns are absolutely vital in the achievement of any global agreement or any global agenda. All of these agreements, and some of them you've mentioned, they're landmark agreements, and we welcome them. And with them has come a whole bunch of different documents, reporting mechanisms, addendums, and we hope additional finance. And a lot of our motivation now is how do we get the finance down to the city so they're actually able to work towards these global agreements. But also our response from African cities that we're working with across sub-Saharan Africa is a sense of feeling overwhelmed by these various agreements and asking ICLEI, and I'm sure others, many of which are probably present in London and listening online, what do these agreements mean for us and how do we begin moving towards the implementation? And particularly in Africa, and it's been alluded to already, the severe resource constraints, both human resources and financial resources, and the difficulty of taking on additional agenda items. And I think it's important that we better understand and unpack how these global agreements can be used by cities to do their jobs better, as opposed to it being an additional drain on resources, on time and capacity. When just reflecting a bit yesterday on these various global agreements and what for us as ICLEI are some of the key binding points, the key trends, one for us is around, a lot of them are speaking about transformation, speaking about business unusual, speaking about a new normal, and trying to unpack what actually these terms, resilience, transformation, mean in reality. I think that's something we really need to grapple with. If we're going to use them in the global discourse, what does it mean for a city? And many are asking us, well, point to a resilient city or point to a sustainable city. And what do you really mean by transformation? And I think that's the challenge we face, because what we're doing doesn't have a precedent and we're working in an unprecedented space. So I think issues around language and around making the discourse a reality on the ground is important. The second for us is around informality, and I think there's others on the panel better qualified than myself to speak about informality and the importance of it, particularly in Africa. But for us, it's about saying that informality is part and parcel of African cities. It's not going away anytime soon. But in fact, can we harness existing structures within informal networks? Can we harness the solutions that are bottom-up, homegrown solutions being derived in these informal settlements to bring about a better world? The third one for us is around a lot of talk about prevention and proactive action. And, in reflecting when David was speaking about, think of an African city that you know well, when you reflect on the realities of an African city, I think one of the most difficult jobs in the world is being an African mayor or an African town clerk or an African city practitioner, because the challenges are vast, they're complex, they're immediate, and many of them are day to day. And we're actually asking these practitioners now to not only deal with quite intrinsic, difficult challenges on a day-to-day basis, but also be preventative and be proactive. And how do we do this? And how do we allow these two sometimes competing realities to be traded off? So for us, it's about putting solutions in place that are good for today, that have ancillary benefits, that are good from a socio-economic perspective, that's attractive to a mayor because will lead to him or her being voted in again, but also with the lens of the fact that it's robust for the future, that it's taking into account increasing disaster risk, that it's taking into account things like climate change. And then lastly, and I think this is an important realm within a lot of work of which ICLEI does, at trying to link researchers better with local government stakeholders, is a lot of these agreements are calling for more integrative, inclusive, transdisciplinary processes. But we know that transdisciplinarity, co-production of information is slow and is challenging, and it's extremely time and resource intensive. So it's trying to balance the fact that we need to understand context particularly well, and understanding context takes time, and the fact that building relationships that lead to transdisciplinary work is resource intensive, but knowing that it's absolutely vital. And I think it's also this debate around this constant call for immediate action, of cross-scale action, of up and out scaling, when in fact, in many senses, we need deep scaling. We need to understand cities in depth to be able to cause long-term change. So I think in summary, these global agreements are wonderful. They're landmark. They have improved on many of their predecessors. And I think all of us as organizations need to be thinking more effectively around how we take these global agreements, make them a reality in cities, and make them not feel like they're an additional burden, but actually assist city practitioners to do their jobs better.
Thank you, Megan. We're going to move for probably about 10 minutes just to have a discussion between the panellists before we open up to the floor. Matafa, I'd like to start by asking you this question that Megan raised about informality. What for you is emerging as kind of critical solutions? Is this about bottom-up, homegrown solutions in informal areas, working with formal and informal institutions? Where are the critical emergent solutions for informal areas?
Thank you very much. And the biggest problem is in Africa, including Malawi, the informal community constitutes about 60% of the population. But in the small centers, near everyone is informal, unfortunately. Everybody is informal. So to start finding solutions to that, you have to work with the people who are living in informal settlements, because even using the democracy, they are the owners of the city. So the critical area to me is to work with the ones that are most affected by any risks, and they constitute the majority. So it's the people in the informal settlements. Unfortunately, it's the other way around. That's why most of the time we see demonstrations, people are getting frustrated because they are excluded. So the critical point is how to include the majority of the people in these settlements. Thank you.
Thank you. And also, David and Mark, I'd like to ask you to comment a little bit on Megan's point about how do we think for the long term. I mean, obviously, this goes against the grain of kind of project and political cycles, but also in terms of underlying research versus the demands for immediate solutions. And is it right that we should be pressing local governments to think in terms of long term when they face such pressing immediate needs? David, do you want to kick off? Mark, come in.
Well, if we look at innovative cities where you've had an innovative mayor and city council with a strong commitment to social justice, and they've done good development, and they've done water, and they've done sanitation, and they've improved healthcare, and they've been having problems with flooding, so they moved to work at a regional level. And all this is rooted in development. And of course, that is also building the basis for disaster risk reduction and for climate change adaptation. In a sense, climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction and development are all concerned with reducing risk. They just choose to focus on a different set of risks, but all of them are committed to reducing risk. And what I've seen is, mainly in Latin America, where outstanding mayors who've done development well and done disaster risk reduction well, and begun to do adaptation well because they can see how it fits with disaster risk reduction, are also just beginning to think, okay, how do we move all of this into a low carbon future? So there's so many overlaps between the four critical agendas: development, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation. And good mayors and good political systems are finding ways to actually reconcile the four.
Thanks. So I'd only add to that the power of visioning, and pick up from Megan's comment about that we are working in a space where there are no precedents. So it is difficult to think of a sustainable city or a resilient city or to understand transformation. And that's because these are very difficult things to attain, and there are structures, both economic, physical, but also in imagination, that have made these things very difficult. Visioning tends to be something that's, I think at the moment, still marginalized within perhaps a scenario workshop, and then is brought to an artifact in a research project. But where I see visioning connected to action, it enables decision makers to think about what an alternative future might look like, and then feel a commitment towards the incremental steps that might be taken to move towards it, recognizing one might never get there, but that it is still the purpose of development to reach towards these unattainable goals and recognize that challenge. So the one word I think is visioning for me, and bringing that much further up the agenda, which connects to this, the sort of the democratic deficit conversation that we've started to open up as well, recognizing there are lots of visions in the city, and that these should all be brought to the table. It's not easy. Where we've done this, in cities, we've worked with decision makers at city level, and it's been very apparent that the vision they have for the city, as perhaps technocrats, is quite different to the vision of cities held by the political class, and indeed that those differences are moving further apart, so that the power that the technical class, the administrators, have to affect change in the city seems to be diminishing.
Thank you, Mark. And Sky, I'd like to kind of come back to you and pick up on this point about democratic deficits. I think there seems to be an emerging consensus that there's a lot of potential in organised communities and kind of grassroots upward initiatives, and you've talked about kind of connecting in partnership with local governments. But where local governments simply don't have the capacity, the mandate, or even the will to provide basic services, what can other actors do without undermining the need to build a functioning public authority? Is Sky there?
Thank you very much. I think the example that's springing to mind for me is actually in a secondary city, so perhaps relevant to some of the points Metafor was making. And also, I think, helps to highlight the challenge that Megan raised with regard to the expensive sort of the assumption that the collaborative processes can be very expensive. I think in Ginger, through the establishment of a community upgrading fund, there was the local meetings between slum dwellers and the municipal council, and there we don't have to invest a lot of money. We have to be able to just support the local government to convene those spaces. And then if we're able to catalyze community action through simple tools like a community upgrading fund, where communities can make these incremental changes, the demands actually for the management of that process are quite small. It was really quite remarkable to see. And the communities built toilets using community contracting, so you're building skills and livelihoods, and also incrementally upgrading the settlements and improving access to services. I think it was a really positive experience, and one that could be explored for exactly the purpose that you raised.
Thank you, Sky. And just bringing Megan back in as well. Megan, obviously, some of Urban Arc and our work has been more focused on working with disaster risk practitioners, but what can we expect of them in terms of addressing the much broader issues of land use, governance, service delivery? What role can disaster risk managers play in building broader resilience?
Yeah, I think as disaster risk managers, it's planners, it's various different levels in a city that have to play an important role in dealing with all of these challenges we've been speaking about. I think our main lesson has been that it's about relationships, that it's about building exceptionally good relationships. And where in our experience we've seen the biggest success, the quickest and the most long-term in cities is actually been sometimes a completely shadow network or an informal network of city stakeholders that work well together. That doesn't need to be institutionalized, that don't need to be mandated to talk to each other. But they often speak to each other because there's some binding issue that all of them find important, whatever it is. Climate change, disaster risk, informality is a challenge in the city. And then two, they have a trust relationship. And it's often at the middle management level where they're able to make decisions. They have power to make decisions and budget to make decisions. But they also are able to liaise fairly easily with the upper echelons of the municipality, the mayors and the city managers or town clerks. So I think fundamental to any change, to any shift in the way African cities in particular go about dealing with these challenges we've been speaking about is building those relationships in an effective way. And it's key between researchers and the practitioners, and I would say absolutely the same between community members and local governments. There isn't a one-size-fits-all mechanism that I think we might be looking for to try and get these various sectors of society to work more effectively together. I think what we need to be doing is be building good champions in the municipalities and capacitating them during a project time frame so that they're there beyond to continue that agenda, and then helping those individuals form effective partnerships to make changes in the long term. So I think the overarching message, at least from our side, is that building those relationships is probably the one lasting legacy one can leave in a city.
Thank you, Megan. And just before we move to open for questions, David, a final one for you, an emergent suggestion that resilience, does it help us or hinder us without getting bogged down in terminologies? Is it a drag and something that's complex to implement for local planners, or is it helping us to understand the way risks are produced in the interaction of different systems and scales in ways that are more helpful?
I mean, the trouble is resilience has joined sustainable development in the word that's most overused in international, the New Urban Agenda, for instance, or the Sustainable Development Goals. The word sustainable got mentioned, I think, 114 times in the New Urban Agenda. Resilience was 33. And it loses its meaning at this point because everything has to be resilient. Economic growth has to be resilient. Transport has to be resilient. Healthcare has to be resilient. It's sad because the original concept was useful. It was an understanding that you can build a capacity to cope with change and to cope with extremes that haven't happened before in advance. So it's a fundamental part of disaster risk reduction. I also reflect on, I'm very resilient to climate change. I'm very proud to say this. I have a house that meets building regulations. I have good quality water, sanitation and drainage. I have insurance for my house. I have insurance for the possessions. I have a healthcare centre, 50 hours, which I can walk into any time I like. I have emergency services that will warn me. Now, these are all fundamental bits of resilience. And of course, none of this resilience that I have came from thinking about climate change. It was from the risk reduction inherent in a democratic, successful city. So there's the process by which we can drive a risk reduction to everyday hazards has the basis to provide the underpinnings for resilience to more extreme events or unanticipated events. And I think it's really important to see it in those terms, not something that's only done for disaster risk or for climate change.